Welcome to episode 53 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who's not familiar with our podcast, please check back to episode 1 for a discussion of our goals and our ground rules. If you have any questions about those, please be sure to contact us at EpicureanFriends.com for more information. In today's podcast, we'll discuss how mistaken judgments caused by illusions should not be considered to be the fault of the senses, but of the mind. Our text will be from Latin lines 324 through 468. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
The eyes you observe fly and avoid a glaring object. The sun likewise blinds you if you look too intensely against it, because its force is great and its images are discharged from above through the pure air and strike violently upon the eyes and disturb and loosen their contexture. Besides, a brightness too powerful for the sight often burns the eye, because it contains many seeds of fire, which piercing the ball give it sensible pain. And then whatever a person looks upon that has yellow jaundice becomes pale and lurid, because many lurid seeds flow from such a body and meet with the images of things as they advance. And further, there are many seeds within the eyes of one so distempered which stain all things with their infection and makes them look pale. Again, if we are placed in the dark, we see objects that are in the light, because when the dark air, which is nearer, first enters and takes possession of the open eyes, the bright clear air immediately follows, which as it were purges the eye and dissipates the darkness the dusky air has infused into it. For this lucid air is by many degrees more apt to move, is more supple and has more force. This, as soon as it has filled the passages of the eyes with light and opened those pores that the dark air has stopped before, the images of things conveyed in the light immediately follow and strike upon the eye and move aside. But if we are placed in the light, we cannot discover objects in the dark, because a train of dark and thicker air follows the bright, which is nearest the eye, and stops up all the pores, and so chokes up the passages of the sight that the images of things cannot be moved or received into it. Further, when we see the square towers of the city at a distance, they commonly appear round to us, because all angles seen far off show obtuse, and rather they do not show at all. Their strokes die away, and the blows never reach our eyes, for, as the images are carried through a long tract of air, the air beats upon them continually in their passage, and so wears off the corners. Hence it is that, since no manner of angle strikes the eye, the stony fabric appears of a circular figure, yet the roundness is not so distinct as if the object itself were really round and seen at a small distance. But it bears a kind of resemblance to such a figure, yet it is not completely so. Our shadows seem to move with us in the sun, to follow our steps and imitate our gestures, if you can suppose that air void of light is able to walk and to follow the motion and gestures of the body, for what we usually call shadow can be nothing but the air deprived of light. The reason is because as we walk we hinder the rays of the sun from striking upon a certain part of the earth, which by that means becomes dark. But that as we leave the place it is covered with light, and therefore it is that the shadow of the body over against it follows us in all our motions. For a train of new rays are continually flowing from the sun, and the first dies away like thread of wool drawn through a flame. And by this means that part of the earth is soon deprived of light and again becomes bright, and discharges the black shade that hung upon it. But in this case we are not in the least to allow that the eyes are deceived. It is their business to discover only where the light and shade are, but to determine nothing whether the light be the same or the shadow be the same that moves from one place to another, or whether it be as we explained above. It is the office of the mind and judgment to distinguish this, for the eyes can know nothing of the nature of things, and therefore you are not to impute to them the failures of the mind. When we are on shipboard, the vessel drives on when it seems to stand still, and when it lies at anchor it seems to move. The hills and plains seem to fly and retire from us as we row, or scour with full sails before the wind. And thus all the stars seem fixed in the vaulted sky, when they are all in continual motion. They rise, and when they have measured the heavens with their bright orbs, they set again at an immense distance. The sun and moon, by the same rule, appear fixed, when experience tells us that they move, and mountains standing at a distance from one another in the middle of the sea, so that a fleet of ships may sail easily between them, appear like one continued ridge of rocks, although widely separated, yet show like one vast island, formed by all of them joined together. So boys, when they have made themselves giddy, so strongly fancy that the walls are turned about, and the pillars run round, that even when they stand still, they can scarce believe that the whole house threatens to tumble upon their head. Thus, when nature begins to display the bright splendor of the sun with trembling light, and to raise it above the top of the mountains, that hill over which the sun just appears and glowing seems to scorch with his beams, is scarce 2,000 bow-shot distant from us, perhaps not 500 casts of a dart, when yet between that and the sun lie many mighty seas spread under a vast expansion of the heavens. Many thousand leagues of land lie between, possessed by many nations and the whole race of wild beasts. So a puddle of water, no deeper than one of your fingers, that lies in the street between the stones, affords a prospect so deep under the earth as the distance between the earth and the wide arc of heaven, so that you seem to look down upon the clouds to take a clear survey of the sky and view with wonder the celestial bodies contained in it, as they seem beneath the earth. Observe, when your mettled horse stands still with you in the middle of a river, and you look down upon the rapid stream of the water, the force of the current seems to drive your horse violently upwards, and hurry you swiftly against the tide. And on which side soever you cast your eyes, all things seem to be borne along, and carried against the current in the same manner. A long portico, though it be of equal breadth from one end to the other, and reaches far, supported by pillars of equal height, yet when you stand at one end to take a view of its whole extent, it contracts itself by degrees to a narrow point at the further end. The roof touches the floor, and both sides seem to meet, till it terminates at last in the sharp figure of a dark cone. The sun, to mariners, seems to rise out of the sea, and there again to set and hide his light. For they see nothing but the water and the sky. But therefore you are not to conclude rashly that the senses are at all deceived. To those who know nothing of the sea, a ship in the port seems disabled, and to strive against the waves with broken oars. For that part of the oar and of the rudder that is above the water appears straight, but all below, being refracted, seems to be turned upwards, and to be bent towards the top of the water, and to float almost upon the surface of it. So when the winds drive the light clouds along the sky in the night, the moon and stars seem to fly against the clouds, and to be driven above them in a course quite opposite to that in which they naturally move. And if you chance to press with your fingers under one of your eyes, the effect will be that everything you look upon will appear double. Every bright candle will burn with two flames, and all the furniture of the house will multiply and show double. Every face about you and every body will look like two. Lastly, when sleep has bound our limbs in sweet repose, and all the body lies dissolved in rest, we think ourselves awake. Our members move, and in the gloomy darkness of the night we think we see the sun in broad daylight, and, though confined in bed, we wander over the heavens, the sea, the rivers, and the hills, and fancy we are walking through the plain. And sounds we seem to hear, and, though the tongue be still, we seem to speak, when the deep silence of night reigns all about us. Many more things of this kind we observe and wonder at, which attempt to overthrow the certainty of our senses, but to no purpose. For things of this sort generally deceive us upon account of the judgment of the mind which we apply to them, and so we conclude we see things which we really do not. For nothing is more difficult than to distinguish things clear and plain from such as are doubtful, to which the mind is ready to add its assent, as it is inclined to believe everything imparted by the senses.
Thank you for reading that, Martin. There's a lot in this material today to talk about, but we have sort of come to the end to the presentation of the evidence, probably is the best way to look at it. And that last part you just read, where many things of this kind we observe and wonder at, which attempt to overthrow the certainty of the senses, but to no purpose. For things of this sort generally deceive us upon account of the judgment of the mind which we apply to them. And so we conclude we see things we really do not. I think that's really the payoff of probably much of what we've been talking about for the last several episodes of the podcast, and all the evidence we've been going through is that the mistakes we make of judgment are not attributable to the senses themselves, but to what we do with the information from the senses when we process it. But that's sort of the end, and we need to go back to the beginning. We are missing Elaine today, who's under the weather, but Charles is with us, and so the three of us can tackle what we have here today. I almost want to skip past the first of the paragraphs that we read today, because that's kind of a continuation of the movement of images that we've been discussing for one or more weeks. Martin, do you have anything about that first passage and the movement of the air between the lights and shadows and so forth?
No, I mean, we addressed this basically last time already, but the one thing which is new, which I think was not included last time, is that if a person is sick, then this may affect the sight. So this is an observation he made in quite some detail,
right,
and which is correct, and so which he tries to incorporate in his all-over explanation. So like general, no? So he really tries to come up with a view which can account for every single detail of what we observed was what concerns sight.
Right. And I think one point that's important to hit on is to always go back to the issue that people say that Epicurus says that the senses are infallible, but he doesn't mean it in the sense that we believe everything we think we see. What he's constantly teaching in these sections is that illusions of all types can happen. And as you've just mentioned, Martin, that you can even be sick and your eyes can be malfunctioning. And under those conditions, you have to take that into account and not just believe that the world all of a sudden has gone blurry just because you've taken too many decongestants the night before. You've got to understand that different conditions can lead to different ways that you see things and take that into account. And so a lot of people who just take a superficial view of Epicurus that he said all sensations are true, these are the passages that they need to know about, because once you understand what Epicurus is really talking about, that's not what he means at all. And it's very easy to ridicule him if you think that he said that, but he certainly did not mean it the way it's taken by his opponents. Now, the second of the paragraphs that we have here starts with the apparently classic illustration that they like to talk about of a tower seen at a distance, and why a tower seen at a distance can appear to be round even though it is angular. And before I forget, I'm not going to take this too far because I think we come back to this point later on, but before I forget, I think it's probably worth pointing out that his explanation here, where he says the strokes die away and the blows never reach our eyes, for as the images are carried through a long tract of air, the air beats upon them and wears off their corners. Now, I could be easily wrong in what I'm about to say, but I believe I've read commentators take the position that this is his explanation for why Epicurus reputedly held that the sun is not as large as some people alleged it to be back in his time. Apparently the mathematicians were, turns out, accurately computing that the sun was huge, but it's my understanding that Epicurus took the position that here on Earth, when we see something at a distance, it doesn't look sharp because of this observation that the corners are blurry to us. And that's not the way the sun can look at times. We can look up at the sun, and the edges of the sun, under certain conditions at least, can be very distinct. And so I think that was one of the arguments that he incorporated into his size of the sun situation. Also, I think there was an argument about how fires or bright lights at a distance seem to be larger than other things. And so there was a couple of things going on that he, and that's where I'm going to bring that to conclusion, a couple of things that were going on into his explanation of the size of the sun. But these things we're talking about, I think, play into it. He knew that there are illusions and that there are difficulties in observing sight. And he said that we can't let those difficulties undercut our confidence in our senses, because ultimately our senses are all we have. And so instead of just throwing up our hands in despair and losing all confidence in the senses, what we need to do is study the conditions under which the senses operate well and the conditions under which they don't operate well, and the different illusions that we come across, and then take that information into account in assessing and processing the information that we get from the senses. So in that one, he's talking about how the shadows move with us, and how that, which doesn't really bother most of us today, but might be an interesting thing to talk about, how shadows operate. Any comment on that second passage, anybody?
No.
Okay. And then the third of the paragraphs that we have is another, I think, extremely important payoff passage, because it says, in this case, we are not in the least to allow that the eyes are deceived. It is their business to discover only where the light and shade are, but to determine nothing whether the light be the same or the shadow be the same that moves from one place to the other, or whether it be as we explained above. It's the office of the mind and judgment to distinguish this, for the eyes can know nothing of the nature of things. That line is starting to strike me as a very memorable line. For the eyes can know nothing of the nature of things. The eyes don't know anything is this point. And if you understand that, then you don't get confused by the allegation that Epicurus held that all sensations are true. As DeWitt says, the word true in that context would be true in the sense of honestly reported, and not in the sense of true to all the facts necessarily. Do you pretty much agree with that part of what I'm saying, Martin? I think that's pretty important. So if I've gotten it totally messed up, please correct me on it.
No, it sounded okay to me.
Yeah. At first, I thought that the I line in the previous sections we covered was a bit of a cop-out, like a very convenient explanation, but when I went back to reread the text, I understood why.
Yeah, I doubt it would be very easy for us to overemphasize the importance of this material that we're reading right now, because this is really the foundation of replying back against the radical skeptics and those who say that everything's in flux and it's impossible to know anything, because if they're right, then we're really in a fix. And of course, we don't think that the gods or kind of ideal forms are going to help us out on learning the truth about things. So we have to have confidence in some kind of a method of learning about the world around us, and the senses are that method. So what we have to focus on is that if we end up with a mistaken judgment about something, we have to backtrack our judgment process and backtrack our reasoning process and question our reasoning. But in most cases, we're going to accept the evidence. We just are going to have to look at a new way of interpreting it to make it fit new evidence as it comes to us. That certainly is a background of all of what we're discussing lately, in the sense that there's the major question of what to do with new evidence and how to incorporate new evidence into old conclusions that we've reached, and what happens when we find some evidence that conflicts with a prior conclusion that we've reached, which is something that happens a lot. And maybe the first of the points that Epicurus is making here is that when we find our existing conclusions contradicted by new evidence, we don't all of a sudden decide to give up confidence in the senses. We go back and backtrack our reasoning process and determine where it was our reasoning was incorrect. One more thing I would point out, though, with the interesting addition that we have just stated, or a rule, I think, of processing, which is that we're going to understand that the senses are honest, and it's the reasoning process that is where the error enters. That's a conclusion. That's a philosophical position. It's also something that we observe to be true, but there's an interplay, a philosophical position plus observations that lead us to our conclusions. So I've said a lot on that passage. Charles, anything you want to comment on that one?
No, not particularly.
I know you're not feeling well today, so I'll try to shoulder as much as I can here. And I suppose if I move to the next passage, I'm just carried on with my same argument, because the next passage starts off, but in this case, we are not in the least to allow that the eyes are deceived. It's their business to discover only where the light and the shade are. And then he goes into the examples of standing on a ship and feeling like the ship is standing still while the coastline seems to be moving. And then the stars looking like they are in one place, even though they're really in continual motion, and the sun and the moon appearing to be fixed, but of course experience tells us that they move, and then mountains looking like a continuous line at a distance, even though they're not. And then the more funny, I guess, example of children who, when it says make themselves giddy here, I think I've seen people interpret that as when they spin themselves around, and so as to make them, I don't even know what would you call it when you do that to yourself. I guess we all know what that means when you spin yourself around and you feel dizzy as a result.
Yeah, not The Bailey translation implies or agrees with that. When children have ceased turning round themselves, so sure does it come to appear to them that the halls are turning about and the pillars racing round.
Right, right. And my mind, reading through the remaining paragraphs of what we've been talking about today, the portico example and then the sun seeming to rise out of the sea. Maybe one point that we really need to be emphasizing about all this is that he's pointing out something that appears to be an illusion at first, and then he's pointing out that we correct that mistaken judgment through additional further observation. We see the sun rise, or we walk down the arcade and see how the pillars are not really touching the floor, and we lift the oar out of the ocean and realize that it's not bent. We correct our mistaken judgments through observation. We don't just simply correct our mistaken judgments by some abstraction that we have come up with from some other source that we just accept. The thing that we use to prove a mistake and to correct that mistake is observation by the senses.
Yeah, I'm curious about the little section of dreams in the last paragraph.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because that one is a little bit different than the rest. And sounds we seem to hear, and though the tongue be still, we seem to speak when the deep silence of night reigns all about us. Is that the one?
Yeah, before that too. That whole sentence really.
Yeah. Lastly, when sleep has bound our limbs in sweet repose, and all the body lies dissolved in rest, we think ourselves awake, our members move. And in the gloomy darkness of the night, we think we see the sun in broad daylight. And though confined in bed, we wander over the heavens, the sea, the rivers, the hills, and fancy we are walking through the plains. So yes, that's an interesting thing to throw in here, because the others are observations while we are awake. These are observations we think we are making when we are asleep. We need to talk about that. Why would you throw that in here? Yeah, is having a nightmare going to cause you to doubt the accuracy of your senses? When you wake up in the middle of the night after a dream of some kind and you think you've been somewhere and seen something, is that something that would cause you to question your eyesight? Surely not, but maybe he thinks that's relevant to include here.
Well, this is from the biography by Diogenes. And the visions of the insane and those in dreams are true, for they cause movement, and that which does not exist cannot cause movement. And I think that's pretty important with all of our talk right now about the sensations. And obviously Diogenes isn't saying that the shadow person that we see in the corner is real or physically exists, but it's real enough to stir emotion and the word.
Stir action or stimulation.
Stimulation, thank you.
Charles, I'm going to go on a tangent for just a second. I had a very good telephone conversation last night with an old friend that I met some years ago on the internet and discussing Epicurus by the name of Browne. He tells me he listens to the podcast, and I appreciate that very much, to have people who are as intelligent as he is and to help. And then when I talked to him last night, he gave me a lot of good input, I thought, about several aspects of things. But one point he made to me is it's clearly a thread of Epicurean thought that images in the sense of pictures are what Epicurus is focusing on a lot as the way the mind operates. More so than necessarily the mind formulating what it sees into words, it really probably formulates what we see into pictures. And what we're storing may well be pictures as much as words. And that's a deep subject that I don't want to go too far into, but the bottom line being that Epicurus was clearly considering pictures to be a part of how the mind operates. So maybe in the sense of pictures being involved, a picture that your mind considers while you're asleep is analogous or has relations to pictures your mind sees while you're awake. And it's really the processing of pictures that he's interested in talking about. So the distortions in the pictures that we receive or that come to our mind when we're asleep could seem to Epicurus to be related to distortions or illusions that come to us while we're awake. It might be something that he would not divide up in the same way that we would divide up, because since he's focusing so much on manipulation of pictures as the way the mind operates.
With that in mind, there's an interesting section from Diogenes as well. For, he says, all sensation is irrational and does not admit of memory, for it is not set in motion by itself, nor when it is set in motion by something else can it add to it or take from it, nor is there anything which can refute the sensations.
Yes, the exact thoughts that you're talking about there will be covered next week in the very next section of Lucretius. We end today before we get to that, but that's the exact point that's made in the following section of Lucretius.
Mm-hmm. I can only assume that the does not admit of memory is talking a bit, or we can call back to Lucretius and the eyes know nothing of the nature of things.
Yeah, that's a good question, Charles. I'm certainly not capable of digesting what's going on here quickly, but it seems to me that you've got to dive into these issues of, is Epicurus talking about memory? I mean, clearly Epicurus knows that we have memory. He talks about memory in what you just quoted. He says that the sensations don't have memory. I think, is that what you just said? What you just read?
Diogenes Laertius, but yeah.
Yeah. So that he's saying that the eyes themselves don't have memory, but he obviously knows that memory exists somewhere. So I guess he's saying that the brain has memory. I guess you'd have to examine whether, what is the memory within the brain? Is it words? Is it pictures? Is it something, some combination? Is it something else? So that when you think about something that you remember from the past, are you examining in your mind a series of pictures, or what exactly are you doing? I certainly don't know the answer to that myself, but it sounds like Epicurus is thinking in terms of, at least a lot, he's thinking in terms of pictures. And Charles, you going back to Diogenes Laertius a lot, that reminds me of the opening of Herodotus. Doesn't he say something about that there's two kinds of philosophy, about words and about reality, or something like that? I would relate that statement to what we're talking about, plus the whole issue of, and this is something Browne reminded me of again too last night, about Epicurus talking about casting the mind. What does that mean, and how do you interpret that? I know there's a lot of commentary out there about that's something that's included in the opening of Lucretius, about the way that Epicurus explored the universe. I think is what comes up in the beginning of book 1, is he casted his mind throughout the universe. And that's also probably beyond our ability to talk about today, but I believe that's some of the Greek that's involved in the discussion of prolepsis and anticipations and what the mind is doing when it goes through those processes.
Herodotus seems to talk about the ideas, or I should say Epicurus addressed to Herodotus talks about images attached to words.
That's really interesting to consider what that means, and the issue of whether a word has any content in it at all other than the pictures or the images which it's attached to. Is it like a computer or some kind of a filing system where you give a number or an identification tag to certain content, but it's really the content that's important. It's not the tag. Is the word anything more than the tag that goes along with the image? This episode is going to be a lot of questions and not very many answers, but I do think that he's raising really fascinating material here. I think you go back to, he's raising these issues, but the point ultimately becomes the sensations are all that we have as our contacts with the universe. And so if we ever get the idea that the sensations are just totally unreliable and we just need to forget them, then we're lost. And he specifically says that next week. He didn't say it this week, but that's the issue with saying that the eyes know nothing of nature. The eyes don't know anything. It's the mind where knowledge takes place, not the eyes or the ears or the sense of touch. So we don't blame them for the errors and conclusions that we make. Even when we're sick, we should realize that the unclear vision that we're experiencing is a result of the sickness and not just because eyes are inherently unreliable.
I don't think this congested throat's giving me any delirium or images.
That's an example. I mean, I guess don't receive any information through your throat, but certainly your throat, your ears, your eyes, your nose, I guess that's the example. Your nose is totally congested. Your nose is not accurately smelling the coffee that you're drinking or smelling anything else around you. And yet that doesn't mean the coffee has no smell. It means that you've got a condition in your nose that prevents it from being smelled. So if you make the judgment that coffee has no smell because you can't smell it right now, that's certainly not the nose's fault.
Where did Martin go?
Yeah, we need you back, Martin.
The problem is currently I don't have anything to say, so I better get muted.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that we're ready to be into close or not, but in addition to just what we've been talking about, one of the issues that revolves around all this is, I think we did mention it at least, was the issue of how we can make a new observation, and new observations are going to just be constantly part of life. And not all of those new observations are going to be consistent with the conclusions that we have reached based on our prior observations. And so we have to sort of come up with a philosophy, or I would equate it to a computer operating system maybe, but there needs to be some kind of a processing theory by which we look at our conclusions and decide which of those conclusions we should accept as firm and which ones are subject to revision, and how to know the difference between those two, which I think is pretty close to one of the principal doctrines, actually, to say that. But it's not in the eyes or the senses that the issue is really confronted. It's in the processing of the mind where I think the issue has to be dealt with. Martin, you got any general rule of thumb as to how you separate what you think is confirmed enough in your mind that you need not worry about it being revised versus those things that you're sure will need to be revised at some point based on new evidence? Is there any way that you describe how you categorize those two types of things? I think at one point in the past we were discussing that. What was it, the 0.15% or something like that that you used as an example of how scientists will decide whether something is certain or not? That's not exactly what we're talking about, but it's not entirely different either from what we're talking about. It's a matter of how do you keep in your mind that there is a distinction between those things that you should be confident about and those things that you can't be confident about.
I mean, normally we intuitively, just by intuition, we can get an idea that this looks reliable. And if we have some doubt, then we can think through it. Is this now an actual deception, or is there a law in science which may now produce an exceptional phenomenon? So we can go through this one. No? So what are the explanations for that? And of course, wherever possible, we try to get more evidence by looking at it from another angle, if possible, touching it or something like that.
Yeah, so I guess if we were trying to list the factors, the number of repetitions, I suppose, would be one. I think you probably said that in a different way. How would you if you've seen something 1,000 times, you probably have more confidence in what you've observed than if you've only seen it twice. So number of experiments, I guess, is one indication. And then I guess if I were just trying to thumbnail it, the number of times you've observed something, and then you'd have to do something to account for the conditions under which those observations take place. You'd have to somehow rank the reliability of those observations in terms of whether there was any distortions or outside influences that might have changed them or made the results flawed in some way. I guess those are the ways you begin, but then that you reach those situations where you've had no experience with something, but somebody comes to you and says, well, Cassius or Charles or Martin, I know you've never studied molecular biology, but I have, and you should accept, and I've studied my whole life with microscope and all sorts of tools that you don't have access to, and I've come to X, Y, and Z conclusions about the operations of molecular biology, or I've come to a conclusion as to the proper treatment of COVID-19. And I know you haven't studied COVID-19, but I have, and you should accept my explanation. What's the right way to consider something that you personally have never had any experience in, but it's something that you really do need to take a position on for some reason?
Yeah, we certainly need to, in a case like this, we need to make sure that the person who claims is not just an imposter, but that he really is a scientist who has made those experiments and observations, and also that he is not a maverick one, but one who is pretty much in mainstream, so that the information is probably the best what we can currently consider knowledge.
You know, I guess I'm subconsciously channeling my other life as a lawyer into this discussion, because this is exactly what courts deal with in dealing with expert testimony in jury trials. I gather that in Germany you don't use the same jury system that we use in the United States, but over here that's a big part of any trial that involves medicine or science in some kind. Both sides will submit expert testimony. And I'm no expert in expert testimony, but I think what the process is generally describable as being is that the judge allows both sides to ask questions of the expert, and before he gives his opinions, he has to do exactly what you just said, Martin. He has to talk about and explain his background and his qualifications and what he's basing his opinions on before he even gets the right to give any opinions. And interestingly enough, I think, and the judge ultimately makes the decision in the United States as to whether he has established himself as an expert using those factors you just talked about, Martin. And I guess the other side that doesn't like him will ask him questions about whether he is in the mainstream and how many other people agree with him or disagree with him. And in the United States, that would be the way you would decide whether expert testimony comes into the trial or not, is going through that examination that you were just talking about, Martin. So it's kind of interesting to me to think about how that has worked its way into the legal system in the United States, that an expert is not just allowed to get up and test, at least in most trial situations, not allowed to just get up and give his opinion on something without first having established to the court that he has the credibility to do that. But there's one more thing I would throw in on that situation. At least in the United States system of justice, I think this may differ from Europe, but in the United States, the jury is not required to believe an expert. The jury can dismiss everything the expert says if the jury finds him lacking in credibility. So that's something else that probably factors into our philosophical discussions about experts as well. I've said too much on all that. Charles, what do you think? Got any commentary on expert testimony?
No, but people say I'd be a good prosecutor.
Well, people run into that all the time. You go to a doctor, you get a diagnosis of something that's very serious, or he doesn't give you a diagnosis and you think you're sick. And so what do? You go for a second opinion to another expert. And I guess any patient is going to have to make that decision about how many times he wants to go to a doctor and at what point he believes that the evidence and the conclusions the doctors have told him are valid. Because you often hear people get a second opinion and get a totally different one from another doctor.
I think in the event of somebody claiming to be, I'm this molecular biologist, if they are mainstream and they aren't rogue, generally a second opinion would agree with them, just as we would have many observations on something that would confirm it.
But the nature of trials, and medical malpractice is certainly an example of it, is you are often able to get experts on both sides of almost any question. And it's always very interesting to find out how much those experts are being paid and what the conditions of their being retained are and the motivations they might have in different areas of science. And so there's a lot of complicated factors to consider. And ultimately, bringing this back to philosophy and life, I guess we are responsible for our own lives in the end. Nobody's going to, in most cases, force us or tell us what we have to do. We have to listen to the evidence from all the different sources and ultimately decide how to live our lives based on that evidence. So I guess in that case, we're sort of performing the role of the judge and the jury in the United States in determining what experts we should listen to and which we should not. Okay, we probably have gone long enough for today. So any last comments today?
Are we halfway through book 4?
We are, I think, almost more than halfway through book 4. These were lines. Well, we got up to Latin line 468 today, and there's usually close to 1,000 lines in each book. So we're probably about halfway through because we finished the major positions on the reliability of the senses next week. And then we turn, because before we get to the end of book 4, we have to go through the love and the sex discussion. So
book 4 is pretty long, though. Book 4 is 1,200, 1,300 lines.
Okay, so we're maybe not halfway through yet then.
Okay.
And hopefully Elaine will be back with us next week. Martin, anything further for today?
No.
Okay. We're going to cover this next week, but one thing that catches my eye before we finish, one of the parts we're going to run into next week that's related to what we're talking about today is a line that always stuck with me from book 4, because Bailey translates it as, I think it's Bailey, as if anyone thinks that nothing is known, he knows not whether that can be known either, since he admits that he knows nothing. That's one of the sort of payoff conclusions of this whole discussion as well. And I remember when I first came across that line and I was reading DeWitt's analysis of that DeWitt points out that that argument is sort of purely logical. It's a very high-level refutation of which turns on the definitions of the words knowing and nothing and all those things that go in with sort of a logical analysis of a position. So it continues to strike me how we have an interplay of focusing on the evidence of the senses, but at the same time employing logical arguments to bolster the same conclusion. So anyway, we'll discuss that in detail next week. Okay, well, Charles, I hope you feel better, and hope Elaine will be back with us next week. And Martin, as always, be looking forward to you too. So with that, we'll close for the day.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Okay,
See
bye.
Bye.